kick off, I'd like to just do an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Cockatoo people and people who've cared for this country for thousands and thousands of years. And I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to any other First Nations people who might be here today.
Good morning everyone. I'm sure everybody's got opinions about cockatoos. I certainly do. I'm impressed by them. They're very intelligent, playful birds, regarded by some as vandals, but that's play behaviour. It's not deliberate vandalism, but it can be very problematic. We'll get right into it. Vital statistics: normally 2 or 3 eggs incubated for about 30 days, the nestlings in the nest for 60 to 70 days roughly. Survival to 3 years old is not known, but in the galah, a detailed study in Western Australia showed that only about 9% of young birds that successfully left the nest reached the age of 3 years. It's likely to be the same with corellas and self-requested cockatoos. That means 91% of them don't make it. But if you think that every pair of cockatoos only has to replace itself in their lifespan, obviously you're going to have a high attrition rate of young. Otherwise you've got a rapidly growing population, which is not the case. Probably live 60 to 70, well they do live 60 to 70 years in captivity. In the wild, maybe 40 years, we don't know, but it's likely to be a bit shorter than captivity because it's a tougher life. Although some people make it pretty easy for them. They nest in hollows in trees from about 1 metre above the ground up to 35 metres, so you know how high is a tree. They'll nest wherever there's a suitable hollow. And they lay in spring. They are usually come back to the same nest hollow each year, and they usually keep the same mate for long periods. They will occasionally have divorces, or if one gets killed by some means, they'll find another one. They don't pine and abstain, but they do have long-term relationships. Very smart birds. Local enhancement is the process whereby some cockatoos that are feeding on the ground will be noticed by other birds flying in the vicinity, maybe even up to 1 kilometre away, and they'll realise that those birds have found a food source, that they'll come and join them. That's called local enhancement. It's one of the means by which cockatoos discover food sources, and probably part of the reason why they're white. Information sharing. That local enhancement is one form of information sharing amongst the birds. It's not deliberate, but it's information being passed from bird to bird. The other method of information sharing that is believed that happens is they roost communally at night, and the ones in the morning that know where there's a good source of food fly very purposefully towards that food source, and the other ones that haven't found a good food source recognise that body language, that direct flight, and they think, they know where there's something interesting, so they follow. And that's another form of information sharing, and that's how birds very quickly build up large numbers around a desirable food source. So that's partly learning by observation. They also learn to open bin lids by observing other birds that have learnt to do it, so that behaviour spreads within the population. At this stage in Victoria, it's only around the Lorne area that behaviour has been reported, but it's widely known in Sydney. And it's almost certainly independently learnt down here. There's, as far as we know, no movement of birds from Sydney to Melbourne. In fact, studies in Sydney have shown that they don't move very far for the most part. They have an excellent memory of their territory, where the food resources are, and when they're available. If anyone has nut trees, they'll know the cockatoos turn up at exactly the right time each year to their nut tree. So I think they've got an excellent spatial map of the area. And that implies that most of these cockatoos remain within a local area, and we think that is the case, certainly with the breeding pairs. It's quite possible that non-breeding adults and young birds that have recently fledged and left the nest may move further. They may come back later on, but the studies haven't been done to demonstrate that. Problem solving, the evolution of the bin defence mechanisms here illustrates that the birds are very good at solving problems. They're very intelligent, they like to manipulate things with the beak. They need to keep chewing things with the beak to keep the beak in good condition because it keeps growing. So part of the reason for some of the damage they cause is its beak maintenance behaviour. And the vandalism, so-called, is again an example of that beak maintenance behaviour. They are very good at avoiding predators. I live up near Wood End on a farm, and I've heard cockatoos suddenly start carrying on like crazy, screeching and flying around. And usually, to me, that means there's an eagle around. And sure enough, quite often we'll see the eagle. And on one occasion, I heard a lot of this screeching and carrying on, and I saw an eagle taking off with a cockatoo in its talons. So they are one of the predators of cockatoos, but so are goannas. Goshawks possibly, possums will take nests, eggs and possibly young nestlings. But they've got strategies for minimising the risk from those things, and one of them is keeping an eye out and vocalising loudly and flying to cover if they see an eagle. And also letting it know that they know it's there. A day in the life of a cockatoo. Wake up at dawn, scratch, stretch, move to a sunny perch. At first light, they like to bask for a while in the sun, and then they usually go and gather grit along roadsides or elsewhere because they process their food in a gizzard, which is a muscular like a mill, and the grit helps to grind up seeds and things that they've eaten. And that's a daily task. Then they find food. That's a whole range of things from seeds, fruits, corns that they dig up, flowers, crop seeds. Most of the feeding's done on the ground. They do a fair bit of digging, along with corals and galahs, and you often see them all together. But they also feed in trees. They roost during the day, particularly in summer. Their feeding period is relatively short because they don't need as much energy to keep warm, and they avoid the heat. So they'll roost quietly in dense foliage of trees during the day, not always the same trees. In winter they'll feed for much longer period of the day because it's cooler, and they also need more food. Usually late in the day they'll feed again, they'll drink, and they go to roost at dusk, not always at the same site, but often they'll have a traditional roost site where they roost in trees together. They can be very noisy at a roost site. I'm going to talk a bit about providing food for cockatoos, or put better, not providing food for cockatoos. There's a number of diseases that cockatoos get, and they can be spread far more readily if they have access to food.
Just move that closer to your mouth so
I'll move it closer to it. For a number of reasons. They're clustering together close to each other, so transmission of some things that are contagious can occur much more easily than it would if they're feeding under natural conditions where they don't cluster together as closely. And also often feeding sites become contaminated with fecal material, and that can be a source for infection of other birds. Psittacosis is one of the diseases that many cockatoos carry. It's also called parrot fever. It can be transmitted to people through feather dust if you handle birds, or from dried fecal material dust, and it can cause serious illness in people, pneumonia-like symptoms, a range of other symptoms. It can cause deaths. It's also a disease that occurs in pigeons, and there's pigeon fancier's disease is one of the names for it. Parrot beak and feather disease, or cytosine circovirus. It's a viral disease, highly contagious, and spread very readily by birds congregating at feeding sites, and that can kill birds. Serious problem. Spironucleosis, it's a single-celled organism, I think, that has been recorded in winter in king parrots, and Hillsville Sanctuary believes that's almost entirely through people feeding them and passing on the organism. We don't know if it occurs in sulphur-crusted cockatoos, but it's another risk with providing food for birds. And salmonella can also be spread, and in some bird species that's devastating populations. And this is the sort of communal feeding or close proximity feeding you'll get at artificial food sites where people provide food scattered on the ground or in a feeder. Two examples of parrot beak and feather disease. The right-hand one is a sulphur-crusted cockatoo that's pretty much bald, wouldn't do too well in winter. And the left-hand one is a very long-billed corella with a more or less non-functional beak. And it's called beak and feather disease because it affects the beak and the feathers, and very often leads to the death of birds. But birds can be symptomless carriers of it too, which can be a problem. Other consequences of food provision are damage to buildings and other infrastructure. Now, when I was with one of the predecessors of DECA, the latest name for DELP, BSE, etc., I looked at about 100 cases where people complained about damage being done to their houses by sulphur-crusted cockatoos, and in almost every one of those cases, they were aware of somebody in the vicinity who was feeding cockatoos. There is an absolute direct link between providing food for cockatoos and cockatoos causing damage to buildings and other infrastructure. The reason for that's fairly straightforward. If cockatoos are feeding in the wild, they spend quite a lot of time getting a full gut, and they're away from houses. If you provide food, you're attracting them down to houses. They fill up very quickly because there's an abundance of food, so they've got a lot more idle time, and because they've been attracted down around houses, that's where they loaf and fiddle around, and one of their methods of fiddling around is chewing window and door frames. And I think they derive a lot of satisfaction out of being able to sink the beak into a bit of Western red cedar and rip it off. They're not eating it, they're not looking for grubs, they're simply entertaining themselves and maintaining the beak. Covered most, and that damage can be some streets away from where the feeding is happening. It's not necessarily next door, not necessarily the house of the people who are feeding them. And unfortunately, many of these people who feed the cockies don't want to stop doing it because they enjoy doing it, despite the fact that they know other people are having this damage caused. Some of them are in denial about it. They say it's not their cockies, but we know better. It's not illegal to provide food for birds, but some councils have brought in provisions to prevent people doing it, and that is an option. I mentioned reluctance to stop. And in Sydney I've heard of a case where some neighbours took out an injunction against somebody to stop them feeding birds because the damage was being caused. That's a legal remedy that's available, but it's expensive, and you might think it's extreme, but CWA Hall at Mount Macedon had $50,000 damage done by cockatoos being enticed next door by somebody who was feeding them. So the costs can be substantial. This was the wall of a house at Anglesey some years ago, but there were a whole lot of houses damaged substantially by cockies down there. Grant's Picnic Ground at Callista used to have tour buses turning up each day, and the kiosk there would sell birdseed, and it was a big part of the advertising for the tour companies was to say, come and feed the birds at Callista. And it was an area run by Parks Victoria. Parks Victoria hated this, and I think they've now stopped it. It's illegal to feed wildlife in a national park, but this was an exception due to a long-running arrangement that had been made. They had the contractual obligation to let that terminate. Anyway, this was some tourists surrounded by cockatoos and other birds that were attracted by the arrival of the tour bus and the knowledge that they were going to get food. Some of the damage to the local infrastructure, the primary school next door had a lot of damage to play equipment and things. The fences around the car park were semi-demolished. You could go into the wood chip business there, I think, quite easily. And that's the sort of damage they can do. I saw a bloke sit at this table shortly after I took this photo and the table collapsed. It's substantial damage. And that's because people have been attracted by, cockatoos have been attracted by food provided by people. Cockatoos, this is a little corella, but they're very playful. I think it's a sign of intelligence. This one was just feeding and then it decided to muck around, rolling around on the ground, finished up lying upside down. They're just enjoying life. I mentioned that, only place in Victoria. It's a growing problem in Sydney. There's cultural transmission, which is birds watch other birds doing it and they think, okay, I can do that too. But they also like to manipulate anything that can be moved. So they'll work out these sorts of problems fairly readily with time, and often it's not all that long. They don't have much or if any sense of smell. Not many birds do. There are a few exceptions, but most birds have very little sense of smell. So they're not locating food by smell. They don't need the food in bins, but I think there's probably satisfaction, enjoyment in pulling stuff out of bins and getting the occasional bit of food as a result. But I think there's a lot of sort of play behaviour involved in just dismantling a bin and making a mess. If food provision is stopped overnight, those birds will simply go back to their normal diet, which they rely on for most of the time anyway. It has no impact on them. And also, having food available doesn't increase the number of birds in the general area. It might cause a local concentration at that food source, and that's that local enhancement that I mentioned at the start. People use all sorts of ways of trying to deter cockatoos, but remember they are very intelligent. They know a fake hawk and a fake snake and a fake owl and a fake cat are fakes. They work that out within a day. These are two cockies chewing a plastic hawk on a pole designed theoretically to scare them off. Those things should not be on the market. People sell ultrasonic noise scarers. Birds can hear ultrasonics as well as we can. In other words, not at all. They can't hear within that range. So it's absolute quackery to be selling those. I've written to the ACCC about it, didn't get a response, and those things are still on the market, but they shouldn't be. Most devices, other than exclusion or designing a bin that they just can't get into, won't work. Scaring methods don't generally work. Now, one of the important things is to understand the law regarding cockatoos. Under the Wildlife Act 1975, all wildlife by default is protected. There's a system for issuing permits to control wildlife, which may mean trap and remove or destroy, and that's called the Authority to Control Wildlife System, TCW system. There are also Governor and Council orders which can declare a certain species of wildlife or group of wildlife to be unprotected under certain circumstances. So with self-crested cockatoos, galahs and hornbill corellas, farmers growing crops who are suffering damage to those crops or to trees on their properties and infrastructure can shoot cockatoos on their farms without a permit. That's the provisions of the Governor and Council order. But as far as the general public is concerned, they're still protected. Councils have some leeway under the GRC order as well, where cockies are damaging playing fields, for example, committees of management or council can destroy them without a permit. Poisons strictly prohibited. There are no poisons registered or able to be used, and penalties are substantial. 50 penalty units or 6 months imprisonment, plus 5 penalty units per head of wildlife. So 50 penalty units for destroying wildlife, 5 more penalty units per head of wildlife destroyed, and a penalty unit is $184.92. So if you kill one cockatoo and they decide to throw the book at you, that's $10,170.60 for one bird. And it's the same for any other wildlife. That's the potential penalty. For more information about the Authority to Control Wildlife System or the law about wildlife, contact DECA on 136186. That's their customer call centre number. And I think we're ready for questions. And also I have copies of my book here, which I'll happily sign for people who are interested.
Thanks so much, Ian. It's absolutely fascinating, that behaviour and the playfulness of them. It makes a lot of sense now when you see the type of damage they do, that it's not about food. I always thought that it was some sort of mineral supplement, but no, it's play. Before we get into what Council is doing to alleviate or try and manage the problem with bins, does anybody have any questions of Ian about cockatoos and their behaviour?